Good afternoon and welcome to the Weekend Wellness Hour. Today we have a relatively new friend and kind of someone who I can collaborate with, Erin Pink. She goes by Pink Mosley, who is joining us today. I met. Do you mind if if you go by Pink? We go by Pink. I forgot to check with you.
Yeah, yep,
Perfect.
you're definitely
Okay.
yes.
Yes, wonderful. So I met Pink a few months ago when I was working with a group of international executive leadership coaches working on a global platform to help train a large company in just how their people can become better managers, better directors. And now I thought Pink would be a great addition to our Weekend Wellness Hour because she brings a unique perspective to stress. She has dealt with people in all walks of life and very high levels in companies where she has to train them how they can use stress as an advantage to help them in their life, in their business, and in their interactions with others. So I really appreciate Pink coming on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
I I appreciate it. And now I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background because you come from not the leadership world in a general, sense. You come from engineering and I'd love to hear a little bit about your story because there are people out there who can relate and who might be shifting their life right now, especially with a pandemic going on. You're looking at other options out there. So can you share with us a little bit about your background?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you're right. Really good point. A lot of big career changes and transformations will happen in the wake of an event like a global pandemic for sure.
Yeah.
For me, I started out training as an engineer. So I am a professional engineer and I do stay active with that. I don't use it every day, of course, anymore, but I still work with a lot of engineers. And I did many years in mostly the consulting arena of engineering. I focused on environmental engineering, particularly in the water sector. So, water management and how water comes in and out of our homes, how we protect water in the environment, a lot in sustainability and resilience at the city level. And as I progressed in my career, I was always my sort of my root thing is that I always am looking for the what's the piece that's holding the situation back, it's in
Yeah.
sort of problem solving. And increasingly I began to realize it's not often about the technology or the engineering design, but it really is about the people issues. And so I migrated towards management, engineering management, water utility management, innovation, things like that, where the financial and legal and people decisions were being made. And I had a long and successful career in consulting, ending up as a director of innovation for a Fortune 500 engineering firm. And at that point, there was an acquisition of my company by a bigger, getting swallowed up by another company. And I had a decision to make because I was on this really fun trajectory of innovation. And I knew that that wasn't going to be what happened in the midst of an acquisition. And I know many people have been through those. And so I made a very surprising discovery, which was that I was going to go out into business on my own. And in doing that, went through a lot of transformation in terms of what I could provide that people wanted most to work with me on. And it turned out to be a lot of this leadership coaching. I still do a lot of organizational consulting at the board level or with management teams, et cetera. But as I continued along this leadership path, I was asking the same question: what's the root issue that really holds people back when they're stuck? Particularly high performance people, high achievers, they get stuck mid-career. And some of the work that I'm doing now, the deeper dives into somatic psychology and neuroplasticity, I have found for myself and others have been absolutely the thing that just gets that unstuckness. The stuck unstuck gets the stress from a problem to a resource and really allows them to catapult into next phases of their career. So it's a little bit of my story and how it all ties together.
Yeah. How did you get into or fall upon the somatic psychology and neuroplasticity? Because those are not words that we hear on a daily basis.
No,
So,
it's not. It's interesting. I started studying that work through a gal. Her name is Irene Lyon, and she has a very successful company now doing a lot of online trainings and a team of people. And she had done some I've sort of, in some ways, following some of her research. She came more from the fitness background, actually. And she reached out to do some online trainings for people who were coaches and were having trouble understanding why their clients maybe couldn't get through a certain block. You know, when you do all the things that usually work, what happens when they don't work? And I was intrigued by that because that's often, you know, where I'm working with people. My clients don't call me when they're feeling really great. They call me when they're feeling pretty stuck, you know. And so I thought, this is what I need. And so I began to study. And so she had done a lot of study. It's the work of, and I'll drop some names here, none of which you know, but Levine and Stephen Porges and Gabor Mate and others who have gone into really understanding the nervous system and how the nervous system is kind of the recorder and then the interpreter of what happens in our environment, and how things can be happening at the autonomic nervous system level, the part that we can't control, you know, with our thinking, that are holding us back or causing us to react in ways that we almost can't see because it's buried so deeply in our system. And that I began to see through some really simple neurosensory exercises, which we can certainly do today if you like.
Yes.
Begin to become aware and work with the stress responses in the nervous system, and just have a whole new sort of world of intelligence that opens up to us that isn't just up here. It's actually our whole body intelligence. So, and that, like I said, I just follow what works, really. I'm an engineer at heart, and I follow what works, and that's what's brought me here.
Absolutely. And I completely understand that. 'Cause when we have something that we see the results of, we're more likely to follow through with it, and we want to share it with other people. So I can see how that's led you to where you're at now and how you help people. So I want to dive into definitely for sure about the presence and looking at those sensory experiences. But first, some of us are not always familiar with somatic psychology. So can you break that down so that way we understand where you're coming from? Because I think that will help, especially with the presence exercises.
Absolutely. So the idea behind, and I'll just keep it really simple in terms of like how the most useful parts that I find in applied, you know, because I'm not a researcher, I'm not doing, you know, a lot of the research that's happening here. I'm using what works. And what I like to say is that when it comes to somatic psychology, it really is about tuning in to our bodies in a way that's much different. We often get, again, for the folks I tend to work with who are very career oriented, who identify a lot with either their working career or the role in their families or a role in their communities, we tend to spend a lot of time in our thinking mind. And that's useful to a large extent, but we tend to miss a lot of important information that's coming at us from our body. And so what soma means in somatic psychology, it's your perception of the body from within. You know, it's what your experience of your body is. And so we talk about mind-body connection and all those kinds of things. This is where we're at. And that's what I've really found, is that if you can come from a place of a little bit more awareness and knowledge of how your body participates in your intelligence and in your thinking and in your decision making, then like I said, again, you've opened up a world that is extraordinarily useful. So that's sort of where the somatic psychology comes in. It's not just talk therapy, for example. It's awareness and understanding of a nonverbal language, of a language that might be very old, it might be very primitive, it might be a lot of other things that is just different. It's like learning a foreign language, and that's how I tend to use it. That makes sense.
Absolutely. And that relates to, sometimes I hear people say their body is just kind of your vessel, but I take it as a step further that our body actually communicates with us. Pain is a signal from our body to our conscious brain that something is wrong, something is off. And it's our job to listen to it. And like you said, it can be a foreign language. And that's why we have people in our world to help decipher exactly what our body's saying. Sometimes we don't always figure that out, but at least we're trying, and, you know, we approach it in that manner. So.
Yeah, it definitely certainly ties into the work you do very well. I even go so far with my clients as to say, let's try flipping the script, because we often, again, we think that our thinking brain is in charge, which it's not actually all the time. Sometimes it's just reacting, and it's like having running thoughts, for example, is a sign of stress. when you have running thoughts, it's a sign that you have stress in your system. And it's almost impossible for you to access your higher level thinking when you're in that state. So a lot of what we do is we try to resolve that stress condition so that you can reconnect with your, for example, social engagement, or with your really good effective problem solving, and not just be churning up here. So it's almost as though if we can flip the script, and instead of having the mind telling the body things, for example, why don't we just relax? Why don't we just relax? And I picture it now as the body saying like, well, that's great for you to say. Like, you don't know here, I've got all this information for you. You're not even listening to me. It's like siblings arguing or something. And so we actually flip it and say, what if the body's in charge for a little while? And the brain just shuts up and says, okay, I'll listen for a little bit. What can you learn from that? And so to view the body, because we have our nervous system and our neurons exist all throughout our body, right? We know like the enteric nervous system in the gut. We know that speaks to us when we're nervous or when we're angry, or in the sympathetic arousal is often in the chest. So, and that's the sympathetic nervous system being the one that's fight or flight, right?
Right.
So all this information that comes, and that's letting everybody talk is sort of the secret.
Yes. And I imagine that's kind of why you use presence and sensory experiences, is to help us say, okay, it gives us a mechanism for finding out what is it our body is saying, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. So how do you approach presence? And I know you mentioned that you have some exercises that you use to help people become more present so they can start to access and listen to their body. Do you mind going through that?
Sure. Yeah. I'll just, the very basic one is one that's very useful. And so the way I typically like to introduce this is, some people have experimented with mindfulness and meditation. Some people have a regular practice of, from any different school of meditation or mindfulness. And a lot of people struggle with it. Some people try and give up because they just don't understand. They're not good at it. They have a lot of sort of negative self-talk about it. And the honest to God is that meditation is an advanced mindfulness practice. And there's a lot of things we can do to prepare ourselves to sit in meditation. I don't think plopping down on the cushion and just saying, again, brain telling body, let's meditate now. And if you've got a lot of sort of stress activation in your body, which is really survival activation, I mean, what are you thinking? Like, you're not really going to be that good, of course, at suddenly sitting still quietly with yourself. You might not have the practice of knowing how to be quiet with yourself. Your body might be waiting to have a lot of things to tell you, So one of the things you can do is do some things that aren't meditation. And we can just do it right now. It doesn't even require any particular postures or moving. We can do it as we sit here. And what it mimics is the idea, and you'll appreciate this because of some of your wildlife photography and the time you spend in nature. What we're really trying to do is mimic the idea and reconnect with the idea of what it's like to have a really functioning nervous system that doesn't get stuck on the, say, the gas and the brake on at the same time feeling. People can relate with that. And so what you can do is use your sensory experience. And if you look, even just with your eyes, you can use your vision, and you can just start to scan the room a little bit. And just notice that right now, at this moment, if you're in a quiet room, or if someone's even in a car driving or whatever, there might be things to pay attention to, but you're not in any immediate danger, right? There's no tiger coming after you right now. There's no life or death situation, probably at this moment, if you're watching this video, right?
Yeah.
And then you can notice things, very simple things like the feeling of your feet on the floor or your butt in the chair. And just notice again that it's a neutral, kind of safe thing, right? This, as much as your thoughts might be running about the past and the future and the kids or the job or whatever, that right now in this moment, we're watching this video together, we're having a wonderful conversation, and our butts in the chair and our space is relatively quiet. And as you do this, you can just begin to tune into how your body is responding. And it's not to say that it's doing anything right or wrong. This isn't judging what our body is doing. It's just noticing, because we're tuning in and it's beginning to speak with us. Maybe what's my heart doing right now? What's my breath doing right now? You don't have to take a deep breath or anything like that. It's just noticing where things are at. Sometimes it's a little more agitated, sometimes it's a little more relaxed. And so you can do that. So you get your vision, you've noticed your kind of near environment, which is, you know, how your body is interacting. You might notice the air in the room, the temperature. You might notice if you have any pain in your body, if there's something that seems a little tense. Again, just noticing, not trying to correct it, just listening. And then you might notice another part of your body that's a little less tense or less painful, you know, something that's more neutral or actually feels good. And that's often what we do in somatic experiencing, is we notice where our resources are so that we have access to resources, meaning what feels better when we start to look at things that don't feel good, you know. And so we want to be able to spend time in both, and know that both things can be true at the same time. You can feel good and bad at the same time. And so we're doing very simple exercises like this. We begin to tune into the body, and we begin to be able to be present with ourselves, present with our experience. That leads us to be a little bit more aware of when we're ruminating in our minds. And we can go through our days doing this. My clients, I would say 9 out of 10 clients say that having a very simple presence practice, just like what we're doing now, what we just did, just a few minutes at a time. I say you can do 2 breaths, you know, and beginning to incorporate that will naturally lead towards wanting to sit a little bit more in meditation, wanting to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes in that space where you're just non-judgmentally aware of what's happening in the moment. And you can do it anytime, which is, you know, it's a lot of fun. So that's one of the sort of prerequisites, the neurosensory work we can do. And there's lots of places you can take it and lots of other things I could share. But those kinds of neurosensory exercises work with the nervous system so that it can re-regulate itself and bring us to a place that is genuinely calm and not forced calm.
Right, because I know from experience with working with people, when you try to force calm and you try to get them to shift into something they're not, it just backfires and their nervous system flares up even more. And so I like your approach of finding something neutral where there isn't an emotional tie to what they're sensing and experiencing. Because so often in our lives, it's either good or bad. It's not just is. And so if we can find things where we have that neutrality, it's easier to start from right there and then go either direction and say, okay, I'd like this. I don't necessarily like this, and help bring us back, you know, to a calm where we can go back and forth. So I get that.
Yeah, and everything's workable, right? At that point, if you start to say this is neutral, this doesn't feel so good, this feels a little bit better, you can start to sort of, you know, tease those things apart. Start to sort of be curious about, why is that? Why do I like this and not like that? You know, what, you know, there's that tension there. I'm so curious about that tension, and just, again, really allowing things to unravel slowly and naturally. There's no quick fixes here, right? I mean, a lot of the tension we carry is old tension. It could even be intergenerational. It could be a family habit we've taken, you know, from our parents and grandparents. That doesn't go away overnight. That's something you play with over time. You know, you appreciate. I get to the point now where I can laugh about things like that. Certain habits I have that I'll probably always have, but at least I can see them now. And that's where you want to get to that place of curiosity.
Absolutely. And I'd love to hear now your take on how all of this, you know, the ability to be present, these sensory experiences, how does it affect our ability to do higher level functioning? So you work with high performing people, and maybe touch a little bit more on parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and enteric, because those components make up our autonomic nervous system. How does that play into all these higher level functions? Because right now, a lot of us are stuck in fear, so we can't get to that, access that higher levels. How do we get there?
Yeah, so this is interesting. Some of the research that's emerging and some of the clinical practice, I'll draw here on the Polyvagal Theory. It's research from Stephen Porges and is being used by many practitioners in the somatic fields. And what it says is that our nervous system evolved, from primitive to, where we are at now, being mammals. And so we have a primitive nervous system that kicks in, it's sort of on or off. And it's when it's basically turns us on, turns us off. And I'll try to keep some of the jargon out of it. But that idea that that's a parasympathetic nervous system, it's a slow down function. Parasympathetic slows us down, but that primitive part of the parasympathetic nervous system, it's in our gut, and it's like that on or off. So, for example, if we were a deer being chased, by a predator, that shutdown is, when you get caught and you're going to get eaten, your body shuts down in preparation. Right. So that's the kind of shutdown. But you'll also see it in like if you had a car accident or something and you go into shock, that's a primitive shutdown. But there's also a low tone to it. That's the one that helps us rest and digest. So there's like a high gear and a low gear. And so it's not all bad. Some of it's good, and it's all good. It's all good if it's used in the right situation. And then the second to evolve is the sympathetic nervous system, which tends to live in the chest. And again, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but where we can feel it. And that's the sympathetic is the fight flight. It's the action oriented part of our nervous system. This is what turns us on. So parasympathetic revs us down, sympathetic revs us up. And that is the second thing. That's what people will often tie with what we call the lizard brain or the kind of reptilian, right? So we go from reptilian, and that's a little bit more advanced of a survival mechanism. But the interesting thing that's emerging is this idea that there's another function of the parasympathetic nervous system that's actually quite sophisticated. And the way the nerves work is they're myelinated, that's a technical term, but it's actually that the way that they activate is more nuanced. It's not just on off. It's not that gut reaction or that fight flight, right? That we use those words for a reason. But this is what we need to do when we want to access higher level thinking and when we want to socially engage. And so the interesting thing about being in a fear state, which many of us are in a chronic fear state in the world today, and that's reality, is that it's what creates that feeling of isolation. It's what creates feelings of loneliness, of not being connected, of not being able to sit and talk with someone who has a very different, say, point of view about something and really hear them out, right? A lot of that separateness comes from living in the primitive and the kind of reptilian state and not being able to get up to that higher level thinking. And so by doing some of these things around having a presence practice or having a meditation practice about knowing where you are, I like to say, like, who's in charge right now? Who's in charge? Like, am I reacting out of my primitive survival self? Am I reacting out of that sympathetic activation? Or am I actually pretty spacious and safe and feeling what we call relatively safe, so that I can hold space for people? And this is where some of my leadership work comes in, because we need to hold space for ourselves, but we also need to hold space for everybody that we're trying to, help on our teams or our community, because none of us can escape primitive and survival and fight flight reactions. There's no escaping it, and we don't want to. That's what keeps us safe. But we don't want to live there all the time. And so knowing who's in charge at any given moment, being able to pause and have a little presence and a little awareness about where we're at, being able to say, maybe I'm not going to let those words come out of my mouth right now, because I'm going to have to pay for that because it's coming from here, or maybe I'm not going to run away from a situation that I might have avoided and run away from before, in terms of being afraid to have a difficult conversation with somebody, being afraid to speak up to our boss or speak truth to power, or any of those kinds of things, to actually be able to hold a little space for ourselves so that we can get to a place where we're accessing that higher level thinking of parasympathetic system, which is the good one. It's the one that allows us to feel really connected with our family and our friends. It allows us to have patience with people. It allows us to be curious about things. So that's, again, without getting into some of like the mechanics of the anatomy, that's kind of how it functions, if that makes sense.
It does. And your point about there's a nuance, it's not just an on-off switch. I fully believe what you're saying about that. And I can see where research might find a lot of information on that. And I say that because when I was training for marathons, to run in Boston, I used that actually to help me run faster. So if I went on a treadmill and I went at a very high speed, of course, the sympathetics kick in, I'm huffing and puffing and I'm going at a high speed. But what I would work on is how to calm myself down as fast as possible so that my body gets into a steady state. And so my arms and legs are just moving, but I feel calm.
Yes.
And it's powerful. And what's great about that is I could see that also working in like a business situation or a high performance situation of speaking. A lot of people get stage fright speaking out there in front of the public. I used to be terrified speaking with more than one person. And I've had to learn how to calm myself down. But I've seen other people do that too as well. Singers who have stage fright, then they get out there and they belt out amazing music. They've learned how to create that nuance and get some of that parasympathetic to kick in, even in a fight or flight situation.
Yes, and that's what's beautiful, because it's not like it's either or, and that's a really important. Thank you for emphasizing that. It's not like you're either in fight, flight, or you're in shutdown, like you're sleeping. In reality, like if you're in a higher stress situation, you're going to have more of the sympathetic fight, flight, more of the tendency to shut down. That's that people think of that gas and brake on at the same time. You can actually have both of those on and feel really agitated, like wired or tired. Wired and tired is another description people use, right? Yeah. That's the classic of having a lot of activation of both systems. But on the other hand, as you point out, there's a good place where, say, if you're, people love to use the example of like a fighter pilot, right? They have to be extremely sympathetically activated to be alert to everything that's going on. And yet they can also be aware of what's happening and stay extremely calm. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's also a matter of time. All of these, when high stress states are time limited. When the adrenaline and cortisol start pumping because you have a high stress situation, like, you're in danger, the purpose of that is to give you a boost of energy to get you to safety one way or another. And if you can't get to safety, then you shut down. But you can't, our problem is that we keep adrenaline and cortisol running through our system at these chronic levels all the time. And why we don't have capacity and resilience then to deal, when the tiniest thing happens and you lose your cool. Well, there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason, because we're already simmering, at kind of a high level. So you're right. And that's public speaking, those difficult conversations I mentioned, lots of situations, again, like when I'm working with my client where we're saying, can we pay attention to keep that good energy, but decouple it from the fear a little bit, and say, also be really aware that we have resources we can draw on to stay calm. And that's where we start to really discriminate and work with our system more actively. And that's a magical place to be. Perfect description of your training.
Yeah, and I imagine you mentioned resilience. I imagine that is a huge skill that we can build. So sometimes when we think of resilient, we kind of just think of it kind of on a superficial level. Yeah, I'm resilient. I get back up after falling down. But I think there's a little bit more to it, kind of coming from your perspective in terms of looking at the autonomic nervous system and how to mitigate stress. So can you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's such a hot topic right now, for sure. And to me, the exciting thing to share is that resilience is a thing. It's not, we tend to throw the word around as though, oh, we wish we had more, or we, whatever. And I guess from my background, having worked on resilience at sort of a societal level, right, working with cities on their resilience, or working with water systems on their resilience, it was always something we needed to define. We needed to know what, if something happens, if the unexpected, because in the world today, you have to just be ready that something unexpected is going to happen. You can't know, what's going to happen all the time. It's just, the world isn't like that.
Yeah.
And so being okay with not knowing, and knowing that whatever happens, we're in the best position possible to not only bounce back, but to bounce back having learned something and having incorporated that new knowledge back into our operations, our life, our, how we show up. And a lot of my innovation work comes into this too, in terms of innovation mindset and learning. So for me, it was always something you needed to learn how to define as an engineer. And so what's cool is that even personally, it's something that you can define if there's something called the window of tolerance. And depending on our personal backgrounds, our family upbringing, sort of the state of our life today, how much stress, chronic stress we have in our life, how well we're handling it. You might have a window of tolerance that's very narrow, or you might have one that's quite big and quite wide. And that window, so inside the window that I'm showing with my hands here, is where we feel like we have the capacity to respond to things, mostly with that higher level thinking. That yet, it's not that we're not going to get stressed, but that we can get stressed, we can recognize it, and we can sort of use all our tools that you and I are just talking about to get to that place where we're staying socially connected, we're staying curious, we're able to problem solve, with, using all our resources. What can happen is, what throws us off is, on the one hand, say if you go above your window of tolerance, if I were, going up here, it's because you have way too much sympathetic activation. And that's where you're going to lose your cool. You're going to yell at someone. You're going to maybe acts of violence in there, right? All those things that are like the hot kind of like, not good, I lost it. And that's just as simple. You go out of your window of tolerance. Something happened and you didn't have the capacity, and boom, off you went. You can still recover and come back, but it's kind of cool to think about. It's just, oops, too far. What can I do to get back in? Do I need to take a hot bath? Do I need to go see friends, which is hard during a pandemic, right? How do we stay connected during a pandemic? Do I need to sit down and have some presence, all these, so all those resources that we might have identified for ourselves. Below the window of tolerance might be that shutdown, feelings of depression, right? Of feeling disconnected, of wanting to avoid situations, of not having conversations we need to have because we're too fearful. All those behaviors, those low energy shutdown behaviors, are also outside of our window of tolerance. So we have like a hyper arousal and a hypo arousal, where sympathetic or parasympathetic are too active. And if we stay, it's okay to go there for a second, but if we stay there, that's not healthy for us. So that idea that you can have that resilience, and it can shrink and it can grow, and to learn more about how to work with our nervous system and really all of our physiological systems. But it allows us, even if we start out with a pretty narrow window, like we all know people, maybe we have been those people who really don't have a lot of tolerance for change, or get really stressed when they have to adapt to something, or get annoyed quickly, or just shut down and don't speak to you, really narrow. But everybody has the ability to learn more and grow that window so that they can get more and more spacious in how they interact with the world. And that to me is like the utmost in optimism, to know that we all, you had mentioned talking about neuroplasticity, and that's what we're talking about here. The old brain science was that you only could grow new brain cells and new neural connections when you were young, but it's just simply not true until we die. It gets a little trickier because you get these sort of like habits that are, in the highways of the brain, but everybody can create neural pathways, and it just takes a little bit of attention. So that's sort of the hopefulness of resilience, particularly going into 2021.
Yes, which we need right now. And, some people pivot very quickly. So I imagine those, when the pandemic hit, who were able to pivot quickly and change their whole career, business model, what have you, I imagine that their window of tolerance was probably a little bit wider, and they didn't have that shock where they went into this frozen state where a lot of us did and said, okay, what does this look like? I don't even know where to go from here. So I imagine going into 2021, when we're thinking about resolutions, goals, one might be a very good one to increase that window of tolerance. because now that we know our world can change in the matter of days.
Yeah.
So we kind of need to work on our resilience to be able to change in a matter of days with it, or at least start growing those skills, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And what that brings up for me, Amy, is this idea that, you know, even if we ourselves can grow. So I totally agree that the best place to do most of our work is with ourselves.
Yeah.
And that there's all lots of folks have a tendency to want to do a lot of work out in the world and maybe not do as much self-care. You know, there's
Mhm.
that feeling that there's so much need in the world, and that you're somehow feel guilty if you take care of yourself, or that there's, you know, you don't want to be selfish. And really the opposite is true, is that the only work we can really be effective at is ourselves. And the more we can be spacious and hold space, then we find that naturally we have a wonderful influence on the world, that we can hold space for other people who are doing their work, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting in my work is, particularly in the last several months, is I've seen people struggling within organizations. And we have to appreciate that organizations are pretty much merely conglomerations of people. And so what you get are conglomerations of, you know, neuroses, and conglomerations of habits, and conglomerations of expectations. And so we're seeing right now many of our old ways of doing things breaking down, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think lots of things need updates, but it can be frustrating when you as an individual see the need for change, and yet your organization or your society or your community isn't moving as quickly or in the same way as you are, or they're not seeing what you're seeing. And that can be a really frustrating sort of phase of growth and evolution. And so I would encourage, you know, anyone out there watching, that it's okay, it's understandable when you feel that way. The resilience really comes when you can create so much self-acceptance and so much resilience for yourself, that you can be a part of that patience and that support, that not everyone's moving in the same way you're moving, but that's okay, because you're there to help them. And yet you can really have that compassion that none of this is easy for any of us. And we all come from a different background. We all come from different belief systems. We all come from different, like some of the prejudices in the world come from a place of fear, and moving through fear is a difficult thing. And we all have to hold that space for each other. So it's tough work. And that's why we work so hard on our own resilience and compassion, so that we can really be there and not contributing. Because I see a lot of people with that over sympathetic reaction or the over parasympathetic reaction, either just throwing up their hands, I don't know what to do, or getting angry back. Like getting angry back. Anger is a good thing in terms of getting that life energy going. It's a terrible place to make decisions from, you know, in terms of like good, kind, compassionate decisions. So knowing again how to work with all these energies that come through our own system, and then being able to look at someone else and appreciate they're going through something very similar. And that's sort of, I think, going into 2021, what I like to work with for myself and for my clients and my community is, you know, how can we really be building up a genuine resilience, and not the kind of resilience that says, well, I know better than you, and so I can be frustrated, or I can pass judgment on you, or I can whatever. That's what's sort of keeping us stuck. To me, we see stuckness happen personally, and we see stuckness happen at every level. And every time we feel that stuckness and that frustration, that's the opportunity that I love to dive into with people. Say, let's look at that frustration, because there's something there, just like pain in our bodies. The frustration we get with the outside world is trying to tell us something. It's telling us how we could, you know, help a little differently, or how we could, you know, shift that situation, or shift a way that we're looking at it. So there's opportunity in almost every situation, no matter how dire it seems, right?
Yes.
And you know, that's a little Pollyanna, but I truly have found that to be the case.
Yeah. And the other thing too is when people actually open up to you about what they're stuck on, there's an aspect of vulnerability that I often see great change come from people when they open up and become vulnerable, because they're willing to listen, to hear other points of view, and they're really ready to grow. So I find that really powerful, that you really take people who are at that stuck point get them vulnerable to get them to shift out of it. And usually with time, people can see how much better off they were after going through it instead of just putting a Band-Aid over the situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's so incredibly powerful. It's hard to put words around, right? And that's why I get a little bit on my soapbox about personal resilience, because when you realize, and I see so many of my clients do it, when you realize you have the capacity to not only hold space for yourself and all of your crazy ways that you show up, but you have space for someone else to show up in all the crazy ways they show up.
Yeah.
The evolution that happens in those moments, the transformation that happens in leadership and just in life, and in the opportunities that begin to flow towards you because you literally have the space to receive them and can handle them. It's just astonishing. And absolutely, yeah, that's the place from which we will really see change. And, even now in the US here, as we're going into, I don't want to get overly political, but there's, we're going through an incredible change in leadership in our country. And there is incredible lessons that we have learned and things that we see now that we didn't see several years ago that we needed to see, and so now we can, to me, begin healing on a societal level. I'm not saying we will, but we certainly can see things and we can begin to take action. Right?
And sometimes we need those experiences to really open us up to, okay, this is how life could be. This person brings this person brings this. And so it allows us to see both spectrums and where we want to go and how it impacts every aspect of life. So unfortunately, sometimes we do need what we've been going through in the past, year even.
Yeah, exactly. It's painful, but as you said in the beginning, pain is sending a message, right? And that's, you have to be willing to sit with it and hear that message in order to not put the Band-Aid on or stuff it back down or stuff it. The thing about stress, whether it's societal or personal, the second you're not working with the stress energy and working with this, why is the survival activation coming up? Why is my nervous system activating, or why is this happening? What, I can't be curious. The moment that you're not working with it, it means that you're somehow stuffing it away. And the trouble is it doesn't actually go anywhere, right? That it just gets stored. And we could have a whole other show talking about how trauma and stress get stored in the body and cause pain and disease. But it doesn't go, so you might as well just get really good, learn that language, learn the language of the nonverbal, of the somatic system, of all that kind, and of others, and how others show up with their somatic experience, and then just start to work with it. And it's just it's so much better. Like you said, once you get through it and you figure it out, you're like, oh, this isn't as scary or as horrible or as, I'm not, I often say to my clients, like, you did that scary thing and you didn't die. Like, it seems so silly, but that's what we're afraid of. We're afraid of being ostracized, being laughed at. We're afraid of death. And those are the things that prevent really being able to embrace that energy. So yeah, that's what I hope for everyone in 2021. We can all embrace that big, powerful life energy and do something with it.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, because, and one of the things you mentioned too is embracing it. And I also talk to people about really celebrate when you get through something. Take that time to think back, okay, at one point I didn't believe I was going to make it through. And I changed that belief about myself. That's huge. And we can then, if we just spend a little bit of time in it, helps to change our neurotransmitters in our brain so that it imprints on us that we have more capacity to face stress, to go through stress, and to shift and transform. So I find it very powerful, not just reflect through the trauma that we just went through for the sake of the trauma, but to see how our skills have changed and how much more capable we are now have gone through that.
Brilliantly said. Yeah, I love and emphasize in my work the idea of sitting with, I did it and I survived that, right? And what's interesting about the somatic experiencing work is that it absolutely, as you said, it does not rely on reliving any kind of stress or trauma. It does not rely on talking through anything. It doesn't rely on having to even know what the stress or trauma is or was. What it relies on is feeling the physical sensations of the stress in the body and working directly with those physical sensations, you do look at, to some extent, how those sensations are coupled, what we call coupling, coupled with imagery or storylines or physical movements that need to happen and other things that happen. There's a kind of protocol we look at, but you start with just the basic physical sensations and work directly with those so that you don't get overly wrapped up in those other narratives and things. And so that, you're right, so you get through it and it's just like, I can in fact just leave that behind. I don't have to keep doing it. And in that natural, again, we talk about that natural relaxation that happens when you do that. Is not at all like the forced relaxation we were talking about, right?
Yeah. I don't think anyone can ever just relax just because we're told to relax. It's in an argument, it's patronizing to ourselves. It's patronizing, especially if we don't have the physical skills to do that because our body's locked up from trauma. So it's important to have other resources like what you do with somatic experiencing to help people learn how to shift out because they've forgotten something about their body and they just need to meet the right people to shift out of it.
Yeah, and it really is just a skill we've lost as humans living in a fairly complex society. We've just lost some of those basic abilities to. You had described it earlier of there's a way you can that you can truly calm yourself, as you described in your training. And it really is, you can think of it as a curve that the activation happens, but then your system wants to come back down to baseline because it wants you to be safe for the next stressor when it arrives. You know, if you're a prey on the prairie, you can't be stressed all the time. You have to have all your energy ready for the time when that lion shows up to chase you. You can't like be jittery the whole time. You know, so that idea that you can get stressed and just come down every single time, get stressed and come down. And it's just throughout the day, you're going to have stressors happen and you come back down and up and down. And that's the rhythm of life. It's okay. Just not getting stuck in any one particular.
I completely agree. And when you learn how to come back down, that skill gets better and better and more efficient. So of course, there's always going to be curveballs, but just at least in the general everyday life stressors, you become skilled. You become skilled at using it to help you progress instead of getting stuck.
Yeah, and it is. It's a skill. It's not a mystery. And, you know, and the curveballs to me, again, speaking to resilience, even those are important. So for me, for example, 2020 wasn't even stressful because of the pandemic necessarily. It was stressful because my dad passed in February, and then my mom just moved into a senior living about a month ago. And it was a long year of navigating those, you know, sort of elderly parent issues, hospice, and all kinds of that stuff in the midst of pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So the layers, and we've all had this. I'm not even saying I'm special, but we've all had layers upon layers, whether you're homeschooling your kids or whatever it is. The pandemic has made everything more complicated. And I had to dig into resilience I did not know I had. And I had to go into, you know, there have been days where I have behaved in ways I haven't behaved in a long time because I was out of my window of tolerance. Nothing I could do about it. I was doing my very best. I was using all my skills, but I had to be able to stop and recognize, like, wow, that's not how you normally show up in the world. That's not how you like to be there for people. And to just be patient with myself, that I had to get through what I had to get through, stay as healthy as I could, but then allow a lot of time after things were settled for my own healing, for my own recognition of what I'd been through. And like you said, I did it. Like I survived that. I did more than I thought I ever could. Now I get to be a little like, wow, I have new resources. Isn't that amazing? So for anyone who had a tough 2020, that's what I hope for you, is that it's, you know, no matter what you went through, there can be a silver lining that you can take forward. It doesn't mean it was easy, but it can serve you in the future. So
yeah, I really appreciate that. It's amazing. Any last minute tips that you have for our listeners and viewers on just how to approach stress and kind of moving forward in their lives?
I think the takeaway, if there's any one thing, would be practicing the pause. You know, that to me is that ability to take a breath in any moment, and really hone the skill of not letting your thinking brain run the show all the time, but hone that skill of checking in with your body and asking it for asking it what's happening, and not overriding it, that alone will change everything. And there's no end to it, right? So I am an expert in this field, and I'm still continually honing how nuanced I can be about that balance between the sort of cognitive intelligence and the somatic intelligence. That would be the number one thing. And there's, again, lots of ways to do that, lots of great teachers, lots of great educational resources, but slowing down, getting out of the hustle as often as we can, not thinking that we have to work so hard. That idea of valuing hard work is wonderful, but it's way overplayed in our society. The hustle is way overplayed.
Yeah.
And so that's that idea of pausing and slowing down is what I would leave everybody with.
I love that. I completely agree. And I think it's something that we could all add into our lives and really help us out. So definitely agree.
And that's where the pandemic was such a challenge, because it was such an opportunity to do that at times. And yet it was so hard because it was right. So
it goes against our nature and our habits. So that's why it was a shock to many people's systems. But so you've been a great instructor, teacher, guest today. So how can people reach out to you to, connect with you?
So, pretty easy. My website is erinmosley.com, ERINMOSLEY. Lots of resources on there. I try to put out a lot of resources, programs that they can look at, and always great if you go to erinmosley.com /connect. There's a little form there. You can just drop me a line, and I answer those and can help you do whatever, set up a call, anything like that. So yeah, love to hear from your viewers and get to know the circles.
I really appreciate your time, and thank you for all of your knowledge and just sharing with everyone today, because we all need it, and just bringing these ideas to our minds helps us going forward and gives us something else to think about and ponder as we make decisions in our life. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for being a great interviewer and for sharing this space with everybody. It's wonderful.
You're welcome. And thank you all for watching us today and listening in with Erin and me as we talked about a very common situation of stress and how it impacts us. I hope this was helpful. Please join us again next weekend for the Weekend Wellness Hour show. Have a great rest of your weekend. Bye, guys.